Hello, I'm Donal McCauley and welcome to medicsvoices.com, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today we're in Sydney and I'm talking to Tim Senior. Tim, you've had an amazing career, but let's bring you back to the very beginning. What started your interest in medicine?
I only ever wanted to do two things when I was a child, and one was be an actor. I imagined playing James Bond and being in movies like that. And I don't think I was ever a very good actor. So then the only other thing that came to me was doing medicine, and I think I was really lucky because I gradually became drawn to the idea of medicine and being a doctor that really fitted with what I wanted to do. So I think I was very lucky in actually deciding that I wanted to do that from quite a young age.
So where did you go and how was it for you?
At school, I was in a state comprehensive in Australia, what they call a public school, and went from there. I did my preclinical at Cambridge University and my clinical at Oxford University, which was an amazing experience. I spent my whole first year sort of looking around at these beautiful old buildings, thinking, wow, I'm actually here. And I don't think I did very much work. I threw myself into all sorts of extracurricular activities. I did quite a bit of acting. I was still maintained that and did some writing and performing comedy. I did lots of music. And my director of studies actually said at the time, and admitted it several years afterwards, that he thought I was doing way too much outside medicine, but I got my degree, so I was very happy with that.
So then your career progressed, and what did you do then?
Yeah, so after that, I did my house officer in Australia, call it intern jobs in Winchester and Bath, beautiful places. And then after that, I knew, because I'd gone to university straight from school, I knew that if I didn't travel then, and I never would, I'd get on a sort of a career path and that would be it. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to have my gap year then. So I actually applied for one of the Australian locum agencies at the time that were placing junior doctors in hospitals, mostly in Queensland. And so they came over and they interviewed a whole group of us. And at the interview, they said, oh, so you sound like an adventurous type. How would you like to go to the Northern Territory? Now, I didn't know any difference at all between Queensland and the Northern Territory. So I thought about it and said, yeah, that sounds good. And so as a result of that, I spent 6 months in Alice Springs and 6 months in Darwin. And actually that was pretty much life-changing. That changed the direction of my whole career from that point and sort of led to me doing here. So that was just over a year. Experiences in Alice Springs Emergency Department, a brief stint in Tennant Creek, which is about 500 kilometers north of Alice Springs. Tiny place. I'm doing some remote district medical officer work across what's called the Barkly Tablelands, which is these beautiful cattle pastoral country. And so I was providing clinics across there until the medical board in the Northern Territory at the time got wind that they got this really junior doctor doing DMO work and called me back to Alice Springs saying, you're too inexperienced to do that. But we had a great time and there were no catastrophes during that event.
Well, I couldn't imagine a greater contrast between the Northern Territories and what you did next.
Yeah, completely. And even I made good friends with another doctor who's now also still working in Australia. And we were both recent graduates from the UK. And between us, we worked out that we were covering the two emergency departments in Alice and Tennant Creek. We were covering an area the size of the United Kingdom, tiny population, but here we were sort of two young doctors. So it was it was a hugely different experience. It taught me emergency skills really well, I think. And so when I went back to the UK and did some locum work in emergencies before getting onto GP training, which was in Sheffield. And so that was it was an incredible experience. It was really formative, I think, for me. This being immersed in because there's a lot of Aboriginal health in those times, the presentations to the hospital. So being immersed in sort of a different culture, you really start to notice the differences between sort of cultures that you work in, I think.
It's interesting to look at that with hindsight because there's so much discussion now about so many junior doctors going to Australia, but it's
Mm.
something you would recommend.
Um, I would. I think a lot of it looks like a sort of tourist video about going and experiencing beaches and barbecues and sunshine and beautiful landscapes. And that's all absolutely true. But I've found that my work in Australia, I really feel I've found my niche working in Aboriginal health in Australia. And that's not that's a life of a different sort of really important medicine that's not quite the sort of the beaches and barbecues image that's often portrayed. I think it's important people coming over, so UK doctors coming over, and I think at the moment what's happening in the NHS is probably the Australia's best recruitment strategy. There are particular restrictions on working in Australia for graduates from other countries. And so it's unlikely that people end up in Sydney. They'll end up in beautiful rural and remote areas of Australia quite frequently.
So let me take you back now. You've done your vocational training and then you went into practice. Tell me about
Yeah,
practice.
that's right. So I did GP training in Sheffield, and I loved that. And that was really where I found out I, that's where I really started to enjoy my medicine, I think. I very much enjoyed emergency, but that was where medicine aligned with what I wanted to do and made me realize the sort of doctor I wanted to be. So that was quite important to me, I think. And the training was very much with sort of like-minded GPs. And I look back on that as being um, I, I was taught by really excellent GPs, and I think that gave me a really good founding. After that, because in Australia I'd met the woman who then we got married. We went back to Australia, initially back to Alice Springs again, and so I worked in Alice Springs as a GP for a year, working part-time in a general practice in the town centre of Alice Springs, and part-time as a district medical officer, flying in and flying out to a remote Aboriginal community called Apatula, also known as Fink, about 400 kilometers south of Alice Springs. And again, the experience of sort of flying to work in an aeroplane and staying in a community was an incredible experience that, again, gave me this sort of sensation of being this little boy on the other side of the world, having these fantastic experiences, and made me realize what a great passport a medical degree and GP training is, in terms of allowing you to not just be a tourist, but be welcomed into communities, initially with some wariness, but where you can actually be of real service and make a difference in communities like that. So that was another year in Alice Springs and doing Aboriginal health there. And so I sort of spent my time, well, Alice Springs and the Northern Territory was really what I knew about Australia then. And so my feeling then was, as a doctor, Aboriginal health was sort of part of what you do. And like if you're in the fire brigade, you go and put out fires. And I just thought, if you're a GP in Australia, you do Aboriginal health. It's really important. And it wasn't until we moved down to southwest Sydney, because we had twins in Alice Springs, and so we needed to be closer to family to help with looking after twins. And it wasn't until moving down to southwest Sydney that I suddenly realised that Aboriginal health was seen as this sort of niche in Australia. It wasn't seen as the sort of routine part of work. And so that was a bit of a surprise to me. When we moved down to southwest Sydney, I actually phoned up the local Aboriginal medical service here and said, "Oh, do you have any work going?" And they said, "Oh, did you see the job advert for male GP?" I said, "No, can I apply?" And I applied and got that job, and that's where I've been working ever since. So since 2005, I've been at that same service.
Well, you'll need to tell us a little bit more about that because for us, Aboriginal health in Sydney, it doesn't seem to be the same fit.
Most Aboriginal people, the largest Aboriginal population in Australia is in West and Southwest Sydney. And so the proportion is lower because the overall population is so much higher, but actually the numbers are very high there. So if you work in a remote area, the Aboriginal people are much more visible, but there's certainly a significant population in Western and Southwest Sydney. The service I work in is an Aboriginal Community Controlled health service, which means that it's owned and run by the local Aboriginal community, sort of on like a cooperative model. And so I'm employed there. It's a really unusual way of being employed in Australia as a GP, is actually being employed on a salary. Most GPs are sort of independent contractors or practice owners in Australia. And that model was the first one of those community control models was set up in the centre of Sydney called Redfern, which is just west of the central business district. And they've just celebrated their 50th birthday. And that model was quite successful and really well liked by Aboriginal people because they felt comfortable going there. They didn't feel well served by mainstream health services. And so now there's well over 150 Aboriginal community controlled health services across all over Australia. And so that's the model that I work in. And actually have found myself really committed to that model. I think it's Australia's version of primary care, as Barbara Starfield would understand it. And it's definitely done with an Australian flavour. And I think lots of health services and systems can learn from the Aboriginal community control model.
Now, you've done lots of other really interesting things. So let me go through a few of them. One of the things that caught my eye is you did a leadership course. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this was really interesting. So this was back in 2010. And I tend to be a little bit skeptical about sort of leadership courses. The books all seem the same, and reading things on LinkedIn sounds like they all sound AI generated. The course I did was about social leadership by an organization that doesn't exist now called Social Leadership Australia. But the idea was that it wasn't bringing in sort of ideas of, so they took people who are wanting to be leaders across all different sectors, but including sort of community and not-for-profit sectors. So it wasn't just about the sort of corporates know how to do leadership, let's import those ideas into social organizations, because it recognized that the leadership in those areas was actually quite complex, because what you were trying to do was more complex than just making biscuits. And a few of the things that really appealed to me about that course, they used a model called adaptive leadership, which is the idea that technical challenges, those are easy problems to solve because you just sort of apply a formula, you do the science, and it drops out. But adaptive leadership problems are those where you sort of keep coming back and revisiting the same problems and they never get solved. And so ways of sort of managing those complex problems. And one of the important things, some of the things that I took out of that were the idea of exercising leadership. So it wasn't the idea about people being leaders, it was about leadership as an activity. And I've never thought of myself as a leader. I've always seen people in sort of charge of organizations and thought, well, that looks difficult. But I can imagine leadership as an activity that people and anyone can do, sort of wherever you are in an organization or within a complex system, you're able to exercise leadership on that. And one of the other important things that taught me was they introduced the idea to me of orchestrating productive conflict. And the idea, I was very uncomfortable with conflict, but the idea that you can actually turn up the heat just enough so that you generate ideas and discussion and people are passionate about things, not so much that people are hating each other and sort of blowing things apart, but not so little that everyone's really comfortable. So the idea that actually conflict can be quite productive. And so you can disagree with people and get, and that can move things along. And as someone who'd been fearful of conflict, that was actually really significant for me.
Now, this idea of leadership and challenges or conflict kind of fits with something else I want to ask you about, which I greatly admire, and that's your interest in communication and throwing out those ideas and challenging people with your writing.
I've always been struck how what we do particularly as GPs, is actually really complex. We're always making these in the moment decisions about how we're relating to someone, about what the dynamics are, about who's in the waiting room. And the people who look at that from outside, it's really easy to look at it and say, well, that's really simple. Look, they've just written a prescription. And this constantly happens. And so I think I came to it from the idea that as a profession, we're just not very good at describing what we do and telling people what we do. But actually, we've nothing to fear from lifting up the bonnet, as it were, and explaining the workings of what we do and the way we come to decision making. And that can actually be really useful for people in understanding how they can make decisions and sort of patient-centered care. And I think people who've written well about general practice, there aren't that many around, and I've always admired people who do that. So Iona Heath is one prime example where she writes really beautifully about what it is we do as GPs. So the idea of sort of witnessing people's distress, it's not just a purely mechanistic biological system. The ideas around the different models we use in consultations that are able to move us away from just a purely biological model so that we can actually handle people's suffering and take a different approach to move people on. And that patients, often without being able to name it, recognize that that's happened, that there's someone that is listening to them, that says their viewpoint's important. And I do think it's really important to be able to describe to ourselves as a profession, to policymakers and politicians and funders, and to our patients that these are the things that we're doing when we see patients and the reasons why it's really important, and that there's clear evidence that that gets better outcomes for people than just a purely biological system.
Now, let me ask you about something else. I think you've been described as the heroic captain of a sinking ship with respect to general practice. And you've just come back from the UK on a Churchill Fellowship. Are you still the captain of a sinking ship?
Going back to the student leadership thing, I think I'm not the captain, but I might be exercising captainship. The thing that I've been really inspired by the GPs I've met. So the Churchill Fellowship is an opportunity in Australia from Winston Churchill Trust to travel overseas to investigate a topic in some depth to bring back the learnings to Australia. One of the things working in Aboriginal health, I realized, was that we have this idea in Australia that all our health problems are related to being rural or remote, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. And then I read the work of the GPs at the deep end who were serving the 100 most deprived communities in Scotland, and they were describing the work I was doing. And it opened this thinking to me that actually that we haven't got this poverty lens on health in Australia particularly, but it means that we don't see that as a problem. So I visited different GPs at the deep end groups in the UK, so in Plymouth, in London, in Sheffield, in Glasgow, and in Dublin as well, and saw GPs working with communities and people who were traditionally disengaged from health services. Health services said they were difficult to reach. And actually, for those people, it's the health services that are difficult to reach, not the patients. And found them doing really extraordinary GP work that was very familiar, quite inspirational, and often not seen by people. And so I've taken the opportunity to see their amazing work. I've been inspired by it. And I think coming back to Australia and saying this is really important, I think both in the UK and in Australia, there are real challenges around health policy, particularly seeing health as being this transactional thing that happens between a doctor and a patient, or between other health professionals and a patient. And that's where the threat lies. And I think going back and being able to say there's a really important, healthcare only works when it's relational, when people feel engaged with a human being providing their healthcare. Now, that's core values to general practice. And so I think celebrating that is really important, and being able to describe that to other people is really important. So I don't think our ship is necessarily sinking. I'm optimistic, but I think we have to be loud and proud about our profession, that general practice has real contributions to make, and that it's really the people I see doing it are highly skilled experts in doing that, and we lose that at our peril.
Finally, let me ask you about something completely different, and that's your interest in music. But
Yes,
not just your interest in music, but you've also commissioned a piece of music.
I did. So I'm a very keen amateur viola player, and one of the best things I've done is manage to maintain that through my career, because there's nothing quite like playing music, sort of being in a big orchestra, for regrounding you when things are difficult again. When the COVID-19 lockdowns hit in Australia, I was looking at what was happening and thinking, this is coming. I'm going to get COVID and I'm going to be shut in my house for 2 weeks without anything to do. And at the same time, I've got friends who are musicians and involved in the arts, and we all depended on the arts completely during our lockdowns. Like we were making music, we were watching Netflix, they were doing sourdough, like those were what sustained us. But the work of all the artistic people I knew had just disappeared overnight. And so it was a real struggle for them. And so I heard an idea from a composer that I know who presents a radio show on Radio National, like sort of Radio 4 equivalent in Australia, who talked about this and said we need to support the arts. And so I thought, well, why don't I commission a solo viola piece to practice when I'm in lockdown for these 2 weeks? And so I did that. And he wrote this beautiful piece called "In My Solitude," based on an old English composer called Purcell, sort of 3 centuries ago, based on a song that he wrote about being inside on his own. So it was perfect for COVID. Wrote this beautiful music, which has subsequently been performed on video by a violist called Katie Yap beautifully. And so just the idea of now having a piece of music that has been created because of COVID lockdown for solo viola that people can play, and I go back to and play, is actually really unusual. One of the special things that I've done that I'm actually quite proud of. It's very different, and so it's something that I do again. As it happened, I didn't end up getting COVID during that time, fortunately, but I did manage to find time to practice and play the piece.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for sharing so much of your life, your profession, and all your other interests. And we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. It's been lovely. Thank you.